Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 226. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, June the 26th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. The Boogie Man. We still have them. They're not the guys who hide in the closet that you were afraid of, or under the bed that you were afraid of as a child. But there really are real life boogeymen today. It's the people who you want to avoid, the people who upset the apple cart, the people who really do the harm in the world. So quick, who is the real boogeyman today? Half of you are probably going to say Donald Trump. The other half of you are going to say Joe Biden. And both of you couldn't be more wrong. Now, you can say you disagree with the politics of both of those guys, but they're not the boogeyman. They're not the Antichrist. They're not the inherently evil ones, okay? The real boogeyman, the real evil one, the real one that we have to fear is the president of China, Xi Jinping. And that's what this podcast is going to be about today. And I will give you proof that this is the guy that we need to watch and condemn more than Trump, more than Biden, more than Putin, more than anybody else. And I'm going to give you 3 instances as to why this is so. So before I get into that, and by the way, my sources for this essay, with the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, CNN, and a variety of United States government websites for the hard statistics, okay? Before we get to the podcast, before we get to the essay, though, a couple of things. Quick Jaguar update. Actually, I'm done stripping the car down. I have been for a little while, and I'm in a holding pattern because I got to wait to get in line to have the car brought to the shop to have the sandblasting and the priming and the sealing and the motor rebuild, all that done. So I'm in a wait mode right now to get the car hauled off and have things done. However, there's a lot I can do because you remember the months and months of taking things off of this car. Most of what I've taken off has to be cleaned, sandblasted, repaired, refinished, redone. And I have purchased a sandblaster for that, and we have a parts washer on the way. In fact, my boys got me a parts washer for Father's Day, except for, like many things nowadays, it's on back order. So I'm in the process of assembling the sandblaster. Soon I will be in the process of assembling the parts washer, and then I can get started on cleaning the accessories on the 1951 Jaguar Mark 7. One more thing I wanted to touch on before we get into today's essay about the real boogeyman. This week we had a guy die, John McAfee, a true software genius, an interesting guy, a 1%er, a probably 1/10 or 1/100th of 1%er when it came to smart people in this world, and proof positive that just because you have smarts and intelligence does not mean you have any common sense at all. John McAfee, in fact, Spanish authorities reported that he was found dead in jail, and that was this Wednesday. His body was found Wednesday in a Spanish jail, a day after a Spanish court ordered his extradition in connection with a federal criminal proceeding in Tennessee. Now, Mr. McAfee, he was the 75-year-old founder of antivirus company the McAfee Corporation. You've all heard of McAfee software. That was John McAfee's. He was the first guy to really invent and market antiviral software. But he had been detained in Spain since October, and that's in connection with criminal charges filed by the Department of Justice's tax division. That's right, tax evasion. Now, his body was found about 7 o'clock in the evening, local time, on Wednesday. Now, his lawyer, Nishay Sanan, she's the lawyer who was representing John McAfee in the U.S. criminal proceedings, said, Mr. McAfee was and always will be remembered as a fighter. He tried to love this country, but the U.S. government made his existence impossible. Sounds like somebody who still wants to get paid even though the guy's dead. But Mr. McAfee took a long and indirect route to Spain. In fact, if you remember, he lived in Belize for years. He left in 2012 after the Belize authorities wanted to question him in connection with the suspected homicide of his neighbor, Gregory Fall, who was found with a gunshot wound to the head. Mr. McAfee, who said he was afraid of being set up, asserted his innocence and fled to Guatemala. He was later arrested for illegally entering Guatemala and deported to the U.S., where he pursued his interests in Libertarian Party politics. Now, in 2019, Mr. McAfee announced he would continue his campaign for president in the Libertarian Party in exile because he said he ran afoul of U.S. tax authorities. Mr. McAfee admitted, "I've not paid taxes for 8 years. I make no secret of it. I have not filed returns. Every year I tell the IRS I'm not filing a tax return. I have no intentions of doing so. Come and find me." Well, they did. Now, after his arrest in Spain in October, Mr. McAfee filed a request to Spanish judicial authorities to be freed while waiting a decision for his extradition to the U.S. But in December, a court rejected his request, saying he was a flight risk. I mean, he had flown from every place else. And that remaining in jail near Barcelona did not pose a risk to his health. Now, during a court hearing about his extradition, Mr. McAfee said the charges against him had a political motive, and if he was sent to the U.S., he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. But the Spanish court dismissed his claims due to a lack of evidence. Now, John McAfee founded the company, McAfee Corporation. It still bears his name, by the way. He founded this in 1987, but then sold it in the 1990s for more than $100 million. So, is this just another case where the U.S. government has killed somebody they want to wipe out because he's hiding secrets? No. John McAfee sold his company for more than $100 million and then didn't pay taxes. Okay. Now, he told Uncle Sugar, "I'm not paying any taxes. Come and find me." Well, they did. And don't forget about the Belize murder charges. John McAfee was an odd duck, a brilliant man, but you know what? You got to pay your taxes. And actually, he was afraid that he would spend the rest of his life in a U.S. prison. He probably would have, because the trial probably would have taken how many years? Let's say 4 years. So he's 79 years old. He gets a 10-year prison sentence. He's 89 years old. Good chance they're right. He'd spend the rest of his life in prison, because the law says if you make money, friends, you got to pay taxes. You just have to. And McAfee didn't want to. He just didn't want to, which is against the law. So sorry, Mr. McAfee. You don't pay the taxes, especially to Uncle Sugar, you're going to pay the consequences. I had an opportunity to interview John McAfee about a year and a half ago, but we ran into troubles because I had to do it via a Zoom call, and I couldn't take the Zoom information and transport it to my mixer box unless I paid a fee, and I wasn't going to do that. And so I never got a chance to interview John McAfee. I wish I had, but I didn't. But John McAfee, brilliant man when it came to software. When it came to life decisions, not so much. John McAfee, R.I.P. Today's essay has to do with the real boogeyman. And the real boogeyman is Chinese President Xi Jinping. Now, a couple of stories out there, two big stories out there. Big to me. I stumbled upon them, and they just haven't been mentioned in the traditional media sources because for whatever reason, I don't know if people don't care about China. I don't care if the media is afraid to talk about China because then they will be banned in China. Personally, I think that's what it is because, as you know, most decisions made by corporations or even people come down to money. And I think this is one of them as well. Exhibit 1 has to do with basketball. And it's a basketball player named Jeff Harper. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute. Strong, I'm watching the NBA playoffs, and I know a lot of these guys are hurt, and a lot of the second string guys are stepping up and becoming stars because the first string guys are hurt, but I've never heard of Jeff Harper. Well, the reason you haven't heard of Jeff Harper is because Jeff Harper is not an NBA player. Now, he's a basketball player. He's played basketball professionally for about 10 years, but he's not an NBA player. He's a international player. He's an American, but he plays internationally. And he went to China to play in a tournament. And when Chinese police detained American professional basketball player Jeff Harper in Shenzhen last year, they didn't really arrest him, but kept him locked in a room with a rancid mattress and a plastic chair for 8 months. Now, the Chinese call this form of detention residential surveillance in a designated location. That's what they call it. And it's used by authorities to hold a suspect for interrogation in a secret location before any arrest or charge is made. Now, human rights groups describe it as a frightening situation that sometimes features violence and leaves the subject cut off from lawyers and family. Now, Mr. Harper said he wasn't physically abused at all, but he was tormented by the uncertainty of what the authorities had planned for him. Now, again, he's an unaffiliated basketball pro who's played in 12 different countries. That's how he makes his living, playing on different basketball teams. Now, Mr. Harper had been in Shenzhen for 5 days for a tournament when he was detained after an altercation he said later led to a man's death. He was eventually released and permitted to leave China in September 2020 without ever being charged with any crime or appearing in a court. Mr. Harper said, they do their justice system totally differently than we do ours. I'm not a fan of it. I guess not. Residential surveillance system has received international attention because of a number of high-profile cases, including political opponents of Beijing's leadership and sometimes foreigners, like Jeff Harper. Now, the benign term residential surveillance denotes the system's origins as a type of house arrest, but accounts by detainees and findings by human rights groups suggest it may be a more systemized process that can feature jail facilities with dedicated facilities, and they also refer to them as black jails. Now, Mr. Harper, even though Mr. Harper's black, that's not why they call it a black jail. But Mr. Harper says he was held in what appeared to be a residential building for police officers. Now, according to research by a team of human rights group led by the Madrid-based Safeguard Defenders, which is a nonprofit group focused on human rights in China, some 5,800 cases of residential surveillance were recorded in open-source Chinese courts in 2020 alone. That's up 91% from the year before. Now, the group, which has tracked rising mentions of the practice in 9 years' worth of court records, estimates the use of residential surveillance is closer to double that, or even more. This is used at a mass level, says Peter Dolan. He's the director of Safeguard Defenders, who in the past ran a legal aid nonprofit in China until he was detained in 2016 and then deported. So he ran a human rights group in China. He was detained and then they kicked him out because state media accused him at that time of endangering state security by funding Chinese human rights lawyers. Yeah, that'll get you kicked out. They don't want human rights lawyers funded in China for obvious reasons. Safeguard Defenders, founded after he left China, has submitted its findings to human rights bodies in the United Nations that have criticized China's residential surveillance practices. Now, the report was released when the report was released, it was followed by recent condemnations by President Joe Biden and other group of 7 leaders. Arbitrary detentions just aren't something we should be doing, said Mr. Biden. Most people rejected the residential surveillance. Most people subjected to residential surveillance, however, are Chinese citizens. Now, in response to a question, a spokesman for China's foreign ministry rejected in a statement any allegations of mistreatment of detainees was baseless and said strict rules govern the use of residential surveillance under the law. But he made no specifics. I mean, being kept for 8 months and not told why, that's bad enough as far as I'm concerned. Now, safeguard defenders, which use an open source legal database in China to tally mentions of the practice in